It was December 19th, 1972. The night before, President Nixon had ordered the largest bombing campaign since World War II. He intended to bomb North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. As he climbed into his B-52 cockpit, Major John Dalton could still hear the previous night's orders echoing through the briefing room. Maximum effort. Repeat, maximum effort. Objective, maximum destruction. Dalton piloted Ivory One toward Radio Hanoi. Following orders, but against his better judgment, he flew the same route, same altitude, same post-strike turn as the night before. A fatal mistake. The North Vietnamese were waiting. They had learned the American flight plan and would fire every last missile if that's what it took. A near hit sent shrapnel tearing through his fuselage. 2 engines were gone. Fuel bled from the wings. The electrical system failed. With his controls barely responding and the enemy below tracking his every move, Dalton had to glide his crippled bomber across the border before it fell from the sky. He was about to discover what maximum effort truly meant. The last years of the war. It was the early 1970s, and America's long war in Vietnam had reached a breaking point. The nation was exhausted. President Lyndon B. Johnson had already bowed out, hounded from office by the gruesome images of the blood-soaked jungles and military casualties across the globe. Now, the burden of ending the war had fallen to Richard Nixon. Victory, at least in the traditional sense, was no longer on the table. The new hope was Vietnamization, an effort to strengthen the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN, so they could stand alone as U.S. troops withdrew. But as American men lifted off the ground and headed back home, the North Vietnamese took the opportunity to launch one of the most aggressive assaults yet. In the spring of 1972, the PAVN swept south in a full-scale invasion known as the Easter Offensive, with 300,000 troops and hundreds of tanks pushing against ARVN lines. Nixon had to act fast. But with thousands of American soldiers already withdrawn, the burden of ground combat fell almost entirely on the South Vietnamese soldiers. The U.S., however, still had one advantage: control of the skies. American engines went off. From Guam and Thailand to the decks of Navy carriers, American firepower surged forward to stop the enemy from every direction. B-52 Stratofortresses took flight, joined by waves of F-4 Phantoms, A-37 Dragonflies, and helicopter gunships. But the weather was not on the American side. As the monsoon season broke loose, pilots were blinded, being thrown around thick curtains of rain and clouds that concealed the terrain and the enemy's air defenses. North Vietnamese troops, well equipped with radar-guided SA-2 Guideline and shoulder-fired SA-7 Grail missiles, waited like hunters. One by one, aircraft fell from the skies. Phantoms trailing smoke, choppers spiraling into the jungle. Entire flight crews were lost without a trace. By May, the situation was critical. The Quang Tri region had fallen, yet Nixon doubled down. American aircraft became the last shield against collapse, with U.S. carrier air wings delivering thousands of sorties to help contain the invasion. In Kon Tum, civilian advisor John Paul Vann took control as the situation was nearing collapse, coordinating strikes that helped to wipe out about 40,000 enemy soldiers from the region and buying the defenders just enough time to dig in. But the enemy would not retreat. Every time one front was stabilized, another one erupted. An Loc was under siege, bombarded daily with thousands of shells. It held, but barely. The South Vietnamese feared this would be the end of their hold on the city. Victory would require a more aggressive approach, and Nixon had to be the one to deliver it. Bombs for peace. Nixon sought to ensure his re-election later in the year. The Paris peace talks loomed, and his path to political survival depended on silencing Hanoi's guns and forcing the communists to negotiate a definite end to the war. To achieve this, Operation Linebacker was launched, an aerial blitz that would mark the first sustained bombing campaign over North Vietnam since Operation Rolling Thunder ended in 1968. However, this time, America came equipped with laser-guided bombs, advanced radar systems, precision targeting, and fewer military constraints. The first waves of aircraft rolled on May 10th. Despite a reduced presence in the region, the U.S. managed to launch over 400 sorties in a single day. Strategic targets fell in rapid succession. The Paul Dumer and Tan Hoa bridges, long symbols of North Vietnamese resilience, were finally severed. The Nguyen rail yard, crucial for Hanoi's supply chain, was bombed into oblivion. However, the American aircraft would not fly unopposed for long, and soon packs of MiG-21s and MiG-19s flew up to meet them. Every mission was a duel between seasoned North Vietnamese pilots and Top Gun-trained Americans. Among the U.S. pilots was Captain Richard Ritchie, flying his F-4D Phantom alongside Wizzo Captain Chuck de Bellevue. As they were flying near enemy territory, their formation received urgent intel from the EC-121 Disco and USS Chicago, announcing that a group of 4 MiG-21s was heading toward them. Ritchie and his wingmen had only minutes to prepare for battle. The MiGs appeared head-on, weapons hot. The Americans braced for impact and then struck. 3 MiGs were quickly shot down in a flurry of turns, missiles, and flares. But the 4th MiG darted for escape. Ritchie went in for the kill, locking on with radar, preparing to fire as the other Phantoms followed. But before Ritchie could get within striking distance, a wave of MiG-19s came in from behind. Guided by ground control intercept, they had trailed the fight unnoticed, ready to pounce on the American jets, distracted by the MiG-21s. Suddenly, the Phantoms were boxed in. Major Robert Lodge, Ritchie's comrade, was hit. The aircraft spiraled into the jungle below before he could eject. But Ritchie held steady. With de Bellevue calling out radar data, he fired 2 AIM-7 Sparrow missiles. The first missed its target, but the second slammed into the fleeing MiG, tearing it apart in midair. So close. By October 1972, Nixon's gamble had paid off. More than 150,000 tons of bombs had rained down on enemy territory. U.S. forces had knocked out 63 enemy aircraft and pulverized hundreds of ground-based anti-air positions. Under the weight of these losses, the North Vietnamese relented. Hanoi's delegation agreed to come to the negotiating table in Paris, bringing Operation Linebacker to a close. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger traveled down to Europe, charged with a different kind of mission, finding a political pathway to end the war that had haunted the United States and Vietnam for nearly 2 decades. At first, hopes ran high. Kissinger worked tirelessly between delegations from North and South Vietnam. The early talks showed promise. Compromise felt within reach. But South Vietnam, led by President Nguyen Van Thieu, demanded international recognition of the demilitarized zone as a permanent border, which North Vietnam had never agreed to. Hanoi, in turn, demanded the release of prisoners and the cessation of American military aid to the South. Still, Kissinger remained hopeful. He stood before the world at a White House press conference and delivered the infamous line, quote, "We believe that peace is at hand." But peace, as it turned out, was not in anyone's grasp. As October turned to November, the talks stalled. Hanoi grew cold. Meetings were delayed and then canceled. No new dates were set. North Vietnam walked away, emboldened by the upcoming U.S. presidential election and the belief that Nixon might waver. He didn't. Having just secured re-election in a landslide, Nixon would not allow the North Vietnamese to slip away from the table. If diplomacy would not bring them back, then bombs would. Back to war. Henry Kissinger delivered an ultimatum to Hanoi: return to the negotiating table within 72 hours or face, quote, grave consequences. But behind the scenes, President Nixon was already preparing to unleash the biggest air campaign of the Vietnam War. This mission would be called Operation Linebacker 2, and it was aimed at breaking the will of North Vietnam for good. Over the previous months, the U.S. had reinforced its aerial fleet in Southeast Asia. By mid-December, more than 200 B-52 bombers were in theater, split between Andersen Air Force Base in Guam and U Tapao Royal Thai Air Force Base. On the morning of December 18th, flight crews at Andersen AFB rushed to briefing rooms. There, the mission was laid bare. Their target wasn't some jungle outpost or border depot. It was Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, heavily defended by a belt of radar-guided surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery. Despite the enormous risk, the crews were told that press-on rules applied, with commanders decreeing that, quote, all bombers will press on, despite SAMs, MiGs, or flak, if there's a reasonable chance to strike the target and recover at an Allied base. Unlike the first Linebacker, Linebacker 2 was set to deploy tight, synchronized waves of bombers, launched at specific times, flying the same routes, altitudes, and speeds. the intention was overwhelming force and saturation, but the cost was predictability. But there was no time to revise the flight plan. At dusk, over 100 B-52s took off. They were flanked by F-4 Phantom fighters for protection, EB-66 jammers to blind enemy radar, F-105 Wild Weasels to suppress SAM sites, and KC-135 tankers to keep the force airborne. As the formation approached North Vietnam, the ground below erupted in flames. Over 200 surface-to-air missiles were launched. 3 B-52s were hit. Radar screens warned the rest of the pilots about the ongoing attack, but the bombers pushed forward. Then came the MiGs, streaking up to meet the American bombers. In the belly of one B-52, tail gunner Samuel Turner tracked a MiG-21 closing in. The fighter looped, dodged, then made a final run. Turner held his breath, squeezed the trigger, and cut it down with a direct hit from his quad 50 caliber guns. It was the first MiG ever shot down by a B-52 in the war. Despite the ongoing battle, the American bombers managed to hit their targets. Airfields at Kep, Phuoc Yên, Hoa Lac, and theIen Bien rail yard and warehouse complex were shredded by ton after ton of high explosives. It was the largest strategic bombing effort since World War II, and it was only day one. A bumpy ride. Before the next night of bombing began, unease took over the briefing room. Dozens of B-52 crews sat in silence as the mission plan was once again projected on the wall. Same targets, same routes, same altitude, same post-strike turn. Then, one voice broke through. It was Captain Strickland, a veteran pilot, who stared down the mission planners. His words cut through the room, quote, "Who's planning such stupid tactics, and why?" Strickland knew what everyone in the room feared, that flying into North Vietnam on the same flight path was a fool's errand. He said it plainly, quote, "The enemy is using your plan, along with the after-release turn and our slow withdrawal, for ease of tracking and shoot-down." But the plan wouldn't change. Major John Dalton, piloting Ivory One, led a formation toward Radio Hanoi. The sky over the capital glowed as SAMs flew up to the aircraft. Suddenly, Dalton's aircraft trembled violently. They were hit. The major would remember the moment vividly, quote, "You could feel the concussion, then you heard it. I never realized you could hear them explode like that. You get static electricity raising the hair on your arms." 2 engines were gone. Fuel bled from the wings. The electrical system failed. The flight controls were unresponsive. For 45 minutes, the aircraft could barely remain airborne as the crew turned south, braving extreme turbulence. As they lined up the narrow runway at Nam Phuong in Thailand, the final controls gave out. The aircraft hit the tarmac, dead stick, but somehow, Dalton saved every man aboard. Meanwhile, back over Hanoi, Strickland braved a swarm of SAMs. His electronic warfare officers screamed warnings over the headset. Missiles at 2 o'clock, then 9, then head-on at 12. Strickland jinked left, then right, white-hot flak erupting around them. At 10 seconds to release, he steadied the bird, opened the bomb bay doors, and dropped his payload squarely onto his target before slamming the bomber into a sharp evasive turn that saved them from a double impact. Despite the odds, no bombers were lost that night, leading Strategic Air Command forces to believe that their tactics were working and approving a third night of strikes without implementing any considerable alterations to the bombers' flight paths. Stumble. On the night of December 20th, 99 bombers engaged in what was supposed to be the last sortie of Operation Linebacker 2. But by now, North Vietnamese SAM operators had mastered the B-52's predictable runs and waited for them with weapons primed. The first to fall was Quilt 3, a B-52G en route toIen Bien. A missile tore through its fuselage, sending it plummeting in flames. Minutes later, Brass 2, isolated in its post-release turn, was tracked and struck. Both missiles hit, forcing the crew to eject near Nam Phuong. Orange 3 met the same fate, destroyed mid-turn over Hanoi. Electronic Warfare Officer R.J. Smith, flying in one of the formations, was aware that they would not survive if the situation continued like this. Configuring his countermeasures just right, he jammed into North Vietnam's radar intercept frequency. Then, over the emergency guard channel, he blew his lucky whistle and bellowed, quote, "Time out." For reasons no one could fully explain, The enemy momentarily paused their launches. Smith's bomber slipped through the window, dropped its payload, and escaped. Whether it was confusion, coincidence, or sheer guts, Smith and his crew survived. Despite this lucky break, by dawn, 6 B-52s had been destroyed. 14 airmen had lost their lives, and others had been captured. The once confident campaign now hung by a thread. And North Vietnam was nowhere near resuming peace talks. The buildup. President Richard Nixon made the call. Despite the losses sustained during the first 3 days of Linebacker 2, the operation would carry on. But the air crews flying into the heart of North Vietnam would not continue without a shift in their tactics. At U Tapao Air Base, General John W. Sullivan broke protocol and bypassed his chain of command, sending a direct message to SAC Commander-in-Chief General J.C. Meyer. In it, he argued that if Linebacker 2 was to continue, altitudes had to vary, inbound routes must shift, and above all, the post-target turns that exposed bombers to incoming missiles had to be eliminated. It was a risk, but Sullivan's urgency was impossible to ignore. The response from Meyer's superior was simple, quote, "We agree." From that moment forward, the bombing campaign was reborn. For the next 4 nights, only 30 B-52s, all based out of U Tapao and equipped with the most sophisticated electronic countermeasure gear, were authorized to strike targets in North Vietnam. These bombers no longer followed straight, predictable paths. They zigzagged across radar zones at new altitudes, forcing North Vietnamese missile operators to constantly recalculate. Their targets shifted as well, focusing not just on military airfields and depots around Hanoi, but also on infrastructure across the entire region. Even with these tactical improvements, dangers continued. On night 4, 2 bombers were struck and destroyed over Hanoi's outskirts by persistent SA-2 SAM batteries. The U.S. was forced to introduce a new weapon into their campaign, the F-111 Aardvark, a low-flying precision strike jet tasked with flying ahead of the bombers to neutralize SAM sites and radar stations, softening the battlefield before the slower B-52s lumbered in. The result was game-changing. From nights 5 through 7, not a single B-52 was lost. The Americans had seized back control of the skies. Enemy radar operators found themselves firing at the dark as decoys and jamming signals clouded their scopes. The arrival of Christmas Day brought a 36-hour stand-down in which no American aircraft would release bombs over North Vietnam. For the weary crews, it was a moment to breathe and prepare for what was to come. Because once the truce ended, the next wave of attackers had to be decisive. An all-out attack. As dusk fell over the Pacific on December 26, 1973, aircraft engines started coming to life across Andersen Air Force Base and U Tapao. 120 B-52 Stratofortresses rolled down the runways. With them, more than 110 tactical aircraft flew into formation. This would be the knockout punch against North Vietnam. For the first time, the full weight of American air power would descend in a single synchronized strike. No waves, nor gaps. Just an aerial wall sweeping into North Vietnam from all directions, overwhelming defenses as they released the entirety of their payloads in under 15 minutes. On the ground, North Vietnamese SAM crews rushed to find the bombers. After days of battle, supplies of surface-to-air missiles were dwindling, but the defenders would not yield. Even as warning sirens went off and radar screens lit up with hundreds of incoming blips, they raised their launchers and fired their last volleys into the sky. Above, F-4 Phantoms swept ahead, using radar and ECM to blind enemy guidance systems. F-105 Wild Weasels dove into the storm, hunting SAM sites with strike missiles, baiting the enemy to fire, then taking out the fire with precision blasts. F-111s and A-7s hovered low over the terrain, targeting airfields and enemy bunkers, denying the VAPF a chance to scramble. The main bombers pressed forward at high altitude in a tight formation. From their open bays, waves of bombs tumbled toward oil depots, rail yards, and storage complexes. Entire sections of Hanoi and Haiphong were consumed by flames. Suddenly, one of the bombers, a B-52D near the end of its run, was rocked by a SAM strike. The cockpit shook violently as shrapnel ripped through the fuselage. The pilot was gone instantly, leaving the co-pilot and radar navigator to fight for control of the aircraft. Despite the damage, they pressed on, completing their bomb run under withering fire. But just as they began to turn for home, a second missile struck, igniting the fuel tanks. The aircraft cartwheeled through the night sky, engulfed in flame, before exploding mid-air. Only 4 of the crew managed to eject in time, and upon hitting the ground, they were captured. But something was different. Their captors didn't beat them, interrogate them, or drag them through the jungle. Instead, they were treated almost as guests. Confused, the Americans soon realized the North Vietnamese were afraid of them. Linebacker 2 had changed the game. The following days repeated the formula of December 26th's all-out assault. SAM launches, initially numbering in the hundreds, dwindled to just 24 per night. American losses kept decreasing. The North Vietnamese had lost their grip on the battle. By day 11, Hanoi lay in ruins. Yet the bombers still came. Every day, they rained fire down on new targets, turning North Vietnam's war machine into rubble. Officials knew they could not endure damage like this for much longer, and as the final American formation turned for home on December 29th, the crew on board received the message they'd been waiting for. Washington had been contacted by Hanoi. North Vietnam was finally ready to return to the negotiating table. The last battle. By the time the final sortie of Operation Linebacker 2 returned to base, 729 bombing missions had been launched over the course of just 11 nights, with roughly 15,000 tons of ordnance unleashed over enemy targets. Despite the efforts of North Vietnam's defenses, launching over 1,200 SA-2 surface-to-air missiles, only 15 B-52 Stratofortresses were lost. However, every bomber downed was a considerable loss. The B-52 was a Cold War warrior that was no longer in production. Each loss represented a hole torn in America's long-range deterrence. For President Richard Nixon, the price had been worth it. As he told the press, quote, "We bombed them in order to get them back to the table." Just days after the end of the operation, North Vietnamese sat back down in Paris to talk peace, this time with fewer demands and no appetite for delay. They agreed to sign the same treaty draft they'd walked away from in October. But in Saigon, President Nguyen Van Thieu was furious. To him, the proposed agreement did not guarantee a lasting peace. He refused to sign. But Nixon had made up his mind. He would not allow yet another breakdown in the talks to drag America further into war. He sent an ultimatum to Thieu, stating, quote, "I have irrevocably decided to proceed to initial the agreement on January 23, 1973. I will do so, if necessary, alone." Cornered by his most powerful ally, Thieu had no option but to relent, and the Paris Peace Accords were finally signed. In the weeks that followed, American prisoners of war began their journey home, and U.S. aircraft lifted off from Southeast Asia, finally leaving the war the U.S. had actively fought in for nearly a decade. Short-lived peace. With America out of the way, it didn't take long for North Vietnam to begin laying the groundwork for a new assault. Less than a year after the Paris Peace Accords were signed, officials declared the ceasefire was over, and the war ignited once more. This time, however, there would be no American bombers overhead, and no promises of rescue from Washington. Deprived of U.S. military support, South Vietnam's armed forces began to disintegrate. Town by town, the People's Army of Vietnam, or PAVN, advanced, reclaiming the territory they had once lost. By March 1975, hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese troops surrendered or fled, unable to withstand the overwhelming offensive sweeping down from the north. By late April, Saigon was encircled. More than 100,000 North Vietnamese troops poised to strike. Tanks bearing red and yellow flags smashed through the gates of the Independence Palace, and President Duong Van Minh, installed only days prior, surrendered unconditionally. The war was over, and Vietnam was reunited under communist rule. As their final military act in the nation, the United States launched Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Marine helicopters soared over Saigon, landing atop the embassy compound as panicked South Vietnamese clung to fences, rooftops, and landing skids. Hundreds were airlifted to waiting ships offshore, providing a final lifeline as the last remnants of the nation collapsed. Operation Linebacker 2 had brought South Vietnam 2 years of independence. But without a continuous American bombing run, peace was always destined to fall apart.